Greetings everyone, Barrett here with Hammerhead Model Making. We are back with the third and final episode in the Higher Call series. In this video, we're going to be finishing up Charlie Brown's Ye Olde Pub, going through the whole paint process, weathering process, pretty much start to end here. And so I'm just kind of showing some pictures from, as a recap from the last episode. We were doing all the construction, scratch building, detailing of the interior of the pub. And now we're going to move on to the painting portion. Now, this video is going to be a little bit longer than the other two videos in the series. And there's a neat little bonus at the very end of the video, so I hope you'll stay through till the very end. But let's go ahead and jump into this. So we're starting off priming everything black. Not a big surprise here. And I'm going to be using some AK Extreme Metal paint here. This is duraluminum. And I've really taken a liking to this paint. And I've been recommended this. Normally I use like Alclad paints for doing heavy metal work, but they just tend to be not very durable. And so a lot of people have recommended, hey, you should use the AK Extreme Metals. They pretty much work the same way as Alclad. They just tend to be a little bit more durable, and I'm definitely finding that here. So this is a good project to kind of really, push how much I like, or just my experience with it. Now, when it comes to painting Ye Olde Pub, and when it comes to painting B-17s in general, you will find there are a lot of different ways that it was done. I tried to do as good of research as I possibly could into how a B-17F would have been painted, and I came across a website called I think it was the One Soldier, or something like that, and it was essentially a very in-depth look at interior colors for B-17Fs with a lot of photographic evidence, a lot of original manuscripts from Boeing, things like that. And so essentially what I gathered, that for the most part the interior of the B-17 would have been left natural aluminum. All of the bulkheads would have been bronze green, and a lot of the stuff in the cockpit would have been bronze green. Now there's some debate that depending on the compartment it may have had some soundproofing, and that would have also been kind of a shade of bronze green / interior green. I'm not doing any of the soundproofing in this particular build, so that's really not an issue. But so this is definitely not going to be like a definitive, the most accurate interior painting of a B-17 ever. But from what I gathered, this should be relatively close. So your mileage may vary. I'll give the standard answer here is check your references. And I mean, I'm pretty happy with the way it looked. And another big thing that you'll see with a lot of B-17 models, and I'm gonna, in this video, I'm gonna talk about painting B-17s in general. There's a couple of things that I'm gonna get to when we get to like the weathering stage, for example, that I think is important to point out when it comes to B-17s. But another thing that's kind of critical here is the use of wood inside the B-17. There was a lot of wood in here that was used for various different applications, but mainly it was for like flooring, tables, things like that, and sometimes doors. And so there's going to be a lot of different variations on how it's arranged within the aircraft. I'm doing the way that I'm doing it, just kind of what looks good to me. And I'm not going to say it's any like more right or more wrong than any other version. So again, check your references. Your mileage may vary. Now, to do the actual wood effect here, I'm trying something that I saw in an old issue of Fine Scale Modeler many, many years ago. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm spraying the parts that I want wood in Tamiya Buff, and then I'm applying oil paint directly to the Tamiya paint. There's no clear coat in between, no varnish, no nothing, and as you can see here, I'm applying it fairly heavily. This isn't like a wash. The paint's not thinned down or anything like that. I'm applying it pretty heavily onto the wood parts, but there is still enough translucency left that you can kind of see some of that buff showing through. Now I'm taking this fan brush, soaking it in thinner, and I'm kind of dragging it across the surface. And what this is going to hopefully do is give me that effect of like wood grain and some texture in there. And I'll be honest, I was actually quite pleased with the overall effect. You will notice that I have a darker brown on my little cardboard palette there. I do eventually mix in some of the darker tones later on, but unfortunately I did not film that. But just note that essentially it's the same process repeated over on top of like the ochre color. But in the end, like this got me the effect that I was looking for, and I was quite pleased with it. So now, one of the things that I need to do is do some masking on some turrets. And the reason I need to do that is because the bottom turret, for example, part of it is clear and part of it is just gray plastic. Now, I'm applying the Edward T-face masks come with masks for both the inside and the exterior of the turret. And what this will allow me to do is paint the full interior of the turret to just so that it's not just kind of like clear plastic on the inside. Now, in hindsight, because I'm recording this, a significant amount of time after I've actually done this work, you're not going to see the inside of that turret at all. It is nearly impossible to see the inside of that turret. But at the time, I felt like it was like, oh, I'm doing something really cool here, painting the inside of the turret. It's going to look all nice and accurate. And I did the same thing with the top turret as well. But, I mean, it's still a good exercise, and it's a good practice to have. So at this point, I can do some pre-shading on a lot of these internal parts here. So that's just what I'm doing, is just a little bit of white pre-shading. And then we're going to go ahead and hit it with our bronze green color. Now, Boeing used bronze green on the interior of this as opposed to like the more traditional, quote unquote interior green. And essentially this is just a darker, like a darkened version that has like a little bit of a like metallic pigment to it. And kind of unique, kind of interesting. I like it. It's different, and I'm not as used to using this color, so I wasn't as familiar with shading it and highlighting it and things like that. But in the end, I still like it. It's neat, and it's just different and a variation on what I'm used to doing. So now we can get the oxygen bottles painted up. This is just Tamiya yellow going down over the black primer and white model. So now we're going to go ahead and give everything a nice good solid coat of gloss here. This is going to protect all of our paintwork, but it's also going to give us a good base from which to do some weathering for the interior. And now one could argue that the interior wouldn't necessarily be super heavily weathered. This aircraft was relatively new and had not done a lot of combat missions prior to this point. But in the pursuit of visual storytelling, I felt like I needed to add some contrast, some depth to the interior paintwork here. So I will be doing a little bit of weathering, not a ton, mainly just consisting of a wash, things like that. But just note that this may not necessarily be prototypical for mid-war aircraft that had seen very little combat at that point. But for our wash, we're going to be using our dark brown wash for green vehicles. And this is my standard, one of my favorite products to use. And if you're asking yourself, no, I'm not endorsed by AmmoMig, but if they're listening, I wouldn't mind an email. But in all seriousness, like I've been using this product now for a number of years, and I like its versatility and its ease of use, and it works for me. So that's why I like it. But we're going to go ahead and give everything a nice good coat once it dries, which usually takes about 30-40 minutes, depending on how heavy you apply it. The excess can just be wiped away with a cotton bud. Now, this only works if you're applying it over a nice good solid gloss coat. If you don't want to apply it over just bare paint, it will eat into the paint a little bit, or stain the paint, and is very difficult to remove. So make sure you're doing it over a nice good solid gloss coat. But you can see here, I'm just trying to remove all the excess in between all of the structural components of the aircraft. So this just helps add some definition to a lot of the stringers and ribs of the aircraft, and really just kind of makes them pop a little bit. And especially where the ability to see into the aircraft is going to be very limited. That contrast helps significantly. So with the wash done, I'm going to go ahead and give everything a matte coat. This is going to knock down that shine, seal in our wash, and kind of allow me to move on to the next steps of the process. And this is like a step that this final varnish step is largely just going to depend on what you want the overall look to be, like the final outcome to be. So that could be matte, that could be semi-gloss, it could be satin. You could even keep it as a gloss. You could do another gloss coat over, seal in all your work, and that could be done. So it's, if you're following along or trying to do something similar, you don't have to follow the exact final varnish that I use, but just note that I'm using it because that's the effect that I want to achieve. So now we can go ahead and assemble the ball turret together. Now, this turret is quite nice in all fairness to HK models. It's a huge improvement over what the old monogram turrets used to be, and it looks pretty nice. But again, like, it's hard to see everything that's inside. So just be wary. Like, unless you want to scratch build the hatch open on the back for the gunner to get into, and you can actually see into it, that might be an option, but you would have to add more details to it if you chose to do that. So at this point, pretty much all the paintwork is done, and we can start getting all of our components and sections and compartments put together. And what I really like about having the wood effect in there is just kind of how much it pops against that green color. So you kind of get like the yellowish brown of the wood popping against the green of the interior, and it helps provide a nice like splash of color and visual interest to the interior, as opposed to something that was just like all green or all gray or whatever. And again, because there are going to be portions of the aircraft that are going to be more open than normal, it helps to have all that additional detail in there. So yeah, there's a lot of components going in here. This is some of that 3D printed stuff that I originally had done up in the previous episode, and just how much nicer the detail is on these parts. And what's cool about the 3D printed instrument panel is the HK model's decal for the instrument panel fits perfectly on it. So nice little bonus there to be aware of. There are a lot of parts that go into the interior of this model. I mean, it's a very busy interior. It's a very busy model. And you'll want to make sure that as you're going through the process that you're like triple checking the instructions, because you don't want to get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm ready to close up the fuselage, and then realize you've forgotten something because it was on another page. So just be aware, be careful, and pay attention, because you don't want to miss anything in here and, you know, miss out on a crucial detail or something like that, or even a structural thing. You will be noticing that I haven't actually done anything for the bomb bay, either in the last episode or in this one, and that's because I chose to use the bomb bay as the location to support the model in its in-flight pose. And it just made sense. Like, the aircraft had already completed its mission. It's already dropped its bombs. It would have no reason to have its bomb bay doors open to see the detail in there. And so it just made sense that would be where I would mount the pole that's going to hold up the aircraft. And so that's why you don't see anything in there. But just note that the kit does have a very well detailed bomb bay, and it's pretty nice. As I mentioned before, lots of detail going into this, lots of little parts. There's a lot of parts that I chose to paint separately just to make it a little bit easier overall. And I say easier just because it's easier to paint the individual parts, but it's not necessarily easier because you have a lot of, you know, loose parts that you have to keep track of. But I just find it a little bit easier to manage for me personally. I know other people that will glue all the parts all down in and hand paint them all at, you know, in situ, and that works for them. And, you know, that's awesome. Congratulations. I'm happy for them. Just, it doesn't work for me. I'm not very good at doing that. So next up, with the actual interior mostly done, we can start working on the crew. And I mentioned this in the last video. These are not going to be like perfect facsimiles of a bomber crew in 1943. They're going to be close, and in my defense, kind of in my mind, the way that it worked out is, you know, they've dropped altitude, they're flying really low, they're all injured, they're dying, they're panicking, they're frightened. They've been moving around the aircraft trying to help different people. Like, they're not all wearing all their normal gear. That was just kind of like the way that it worked out in my mind, and made sense to me. So I think it'll be good enough, because I hope in the end that people will be able to focus on the story that's trying to be told, rather than like the super hyper details, accuracy details, things like that. And it was more important to me that that these figures have emotion and convey a sense of what's happening. And I think I'm now a few weeks, at the time that I'm recording this, I'm a few weeks away from having completed the kit, or completed the project, and each time I look at it and really stare at it and just kind of take it all in, like I'm definitely able to get the story beats out of these figures. I wish that I was a more proficient figure painter, and I wish that I had the skills to really push the detail on these figures. And I at some point, that's something that's a skill that I want to hone and sharpen. But for now, this will suffice, and it'll get me to where I want to go. Another thing that I mentioned in the previous video about the figures was my dilemma with trying to depict death and violence in here. And so in just a little bit, I'm going to have a little bit of a warning on the screen, because I'm going to be portraying blood and violence here. And I try to maintain a somewhat family-friendly image here on the channel. And so just be warned if you have young, sensitive viewers. I mean, it's not like crazy realistic graphic, but nonetheless, it can be violent. So just as a warning here, be aware that there will be a few shots of blood here, mainly in this one section. There's another section a little bit later on where you'll see it, and then at the very end, you'll catch glimpses of it. But I just wanted people to be cognizant of what's going on. And again, I really struggled with how I should depict this and how I should treat this, and in the end, I decided just to be as authentic and accurate as possible, so as to not diminish the sacrifice and bravery of these men. And so for the effects that I'm going with, I'm just using Tamiya Clear Red. This would be probably a little bit brighter than normal blood, but again, because of the limited visibility into the aircraft interior, I kind of needed it to be a little bit more extreme, and I would say even maybe slightly cartoonish. But I think in the end, it gave the look that I was really after, and I think it helps to portray kind of the horrific nature of what happened to these men on this day. And so the figure there that was laying down, that is the right waist gunner, and he pretty much had his leg severed from 20mm cannon fire. Destroyed his gun station, ripped his gun out the aircraft. The other torso there that you saw, that's the tail gunner. He was pretty much killed rather quickly through cannon fire from, they believe, an FW-190. And what I'm actually doing here is depicting, kind of the violence on the inside of the tail gunner's canopy. And it's really a morbid process of going through this and trying to be like, okay, I know what I'm depicting, I know what's happening, but it's strange. So anyways, we're going to go ahead and take a break from my commentary here, and we're going to have my father return, and he's going to give us a little bit of a perspective of Franz Stigler.
The Day I Met the B-17, told by Franz Stigler. Excerpts from A Higher Call by Adam Makos. It was December 20th, 1943, a cold, gray day over northern Germany. By then, I had flown more missions than I had cared to count. I had seen comrades shot down. I had been shot at more times than I could remember. That winter, my country was burning. The bombers came day after day, and we were ordered to stop them at all costs. That morning, I had already taken off once, fought, landed, refueled, and rearmed. And then, late in the day, I scrambled again. As I climbed into the sky in my Messerschmitt 109, I spotted something unusual. Off in the distance, lumbering slowly, was a B-17 Flying Fortress. It was not in formation. It was alone. That was strange. American bombers always flew together in great defensive boxes. To be separated usually meant only one thing. It was badly damaged. I pushed the throttle forward and closed in. As I came closer, I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The bomber was shot to pieces. Its nose was smashed open, and its tail was shredded. One engine was dead, another was sputtering. The skin of the fuselage was torn open, and I could clearly see through the plane in places. And yet it was still flying. I moved behind it, preparing for an easy kill. A crippled bomber, that was exactly the kind of target we were expected to finish off. In fact, that kill would have completed my tally to earn the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. One burst from my machine guns, and it would be all over. But I looked more closely. Through the holes in the fuselage, I could see men inside. They were not fighting me. They were not manning their guns. They were wounded, tending to one another. I saw blood on the floor, bandages hastily wrapped, faces pale and exhausted. One gunner was slumped over, dead at his station. Another was barely conscious. And in that moment, my hand froze on the trigger. I thought of my training, I thought of my orders, and then I thought of something else. I remembered my time in North Africa, flying under Hans Joachim Marcel. He had told me once, "You fly by the rules of honor. Do not shoot a man in his parachute. You do not kill unnecessarily." Marcel had taught me that even in war, there are limits. Looking at the bomber, I realized these men were no longer combatants. They were helpless. To shoot them down would not have been a victory. It would have been murder. I eased my finger off the trigger and made my decision. I pulled up alongside the bomber, close enough to see the pilot in his seat. He was just a young man, maybe in his early 20s. His face was pale, his eyes locked straight forward, focused on survival. Later I learned his name, Charlie Brown from West Virginia. I flew wingtip to wingtip with him. At first, he must have thought I was toying with him, about to finish the job. But instead, I gestured. I tried to signal. Turn east. Land in Germany. You can surrender, and your men will live. But he did not understand, or maybe simply refused. He kept flying north, towards the North Sea, towards home. So I made another choice. If he was going to try to make it back to England, I would see him pass the coastal flak batteries. German anti-aircraft guns would fire on anything that came near, friend or foe. If they saw a lone B-17 limping by itself, they would surely destroy it. But if they saw a German fighter escorting it, maybe they would hold their fire. So I stayed by his side. We flew together, German and American, enemies who did not fire a shot at one another. I could see the disbelief on the faces of his crew as they peered out at me from their broken fortress. When we reached the coast, I gave him a final salute, an acknowledgement from one pilot to another. Then I broke away and turned back towards Germany. He continued on, alone across the sea. That was the end of the mission for me. I landed silent. I told no one. To spare an enemy's life was dangerous. If words had gotten back to my comrades, I could face a court-martial, even execution. So I kept it to myself. For decades, I never spoke of it. And yet, I never forgot it. You see, in war we are taught to hate, to dehumanize, to see only uniforms, not men. But that day, I did not see Nazis or Americans, victors or victims. I saw fellow airmen wounded and far from home, trying desperately to survive. I asked myself, what would I want if I were in that bomber? What would my family hope for if I were the one flying home with death all around me? And the answer was clear. I could not pull the trigger. Many years later, nearly 50 years, in fact, I finally met Charlie Brown. He had survived the flight. He made it back to England, and his crew had lived. When we met, he told me that for decades, he too wondered about the German pilot who had spared him. We embraced, not as enemies, but as brothers. Our friendship lasted the rest of our lives. When I think back to December 20th, 1943, I do not think of medals or victories. I think of a moment when mercy triumphed over hate. In that instant, I remembered that even in the darkest of wars, we still have the power to choose. I see the humanity in others, and to act not with cruelty, but with honor. That day, I chose not to kill, and it was one of the most important victories of my life.
I'll tell you what, my dad makes it hard to follow up his narration. Quite an interesting to get the perspective of Franz Stigler on the situation. And later on, we'll hear back again from my father, kind of going over the full accounting of Charlie Brown, Yield Pub, and their mission to Bremen. Right now, you can see on the build that I've been adding all of the final details to the interior, including a couple hundred 3D printed empty 50 caliber shells that have been littering around the bomber. I remember seeing pictures of the interior of the gunner's compartments after a mission, and there just being an ocean of spent brass in there. And that was one of the things that, from the very onset of this project, I knew that I wanted to try and capture that. And even though I didn't necessarily add as many 50 caliber shells as I probably could have, I think it conveys the point that they were on a mission and they had a job to do, and they tried to execute that job the best of their ability. And in so doing, the inside of these bombers get cluttered and cramped and full of debris and the detritus of war. You'll also notice I had a bunch of papers into some of the compartments. In the book, the author calls out the fact that in a couple of the compartments, like the notes compartment, the radio compartment that had been, had sections blown out and exposed to the airflow, there was papers everywhere. And so I tried to figure out, what kind of papers would those be? What kind of papers would they have on a bomber like this? And I came to the conclusion they were probably logs of some sort. I'm sure that the navigator had navigation logs, the bombardier had target information, things like that. The radio operator would certainly have radio logs. And so that was kind of my thinking, is those types of logs that the crew would have kept on these missions would have been blown around, in these intense moments of carnage. And then you have all the spent brass everywhere. You have blood all over the interior. Everybody's bleeding and injured, and very, very chaotic. So at this point, I'm pretty much ready to close up the fuselage. And this was a moment in the build. So up to this point, this build had taken me about, I'd say almost 4.5 months. I wasn't working on it continuously. I was working on other projects at the same time. I had about usually between 2 and 3 different projects going on at any one time. So I'd work on this for a little bit, then switch over to the other projects. And there was a couple of periods of time where I didn't really have the drive and the fire to really like work on this full steam. And so there was just a lot of times where I just didn't work on it for a week at a time or 2 weeks at a time because throughout this whole process I was apprehensive, like, am I going to get this right? Am I going to do it right? Is my vision, am I going to be able to realize my vision here? And this was one of those projects where I didn't want to screw up. Like, it was important enough to me that I didn't want it to get ruined and for it to turn out badly. And I knew that, as I was going through this whole process, adding all the details to the interior, that I caused a few self-inflicted fit issues, and I was kind of dreading having to take care of those. There was a really ugly seam around the nose that I was going to have to take care of. So the nose section is separate from the rest of the fuselage because they designed it that way so they could do the different, like the G variant with the chin turret and different window configurations for the nose. But HK Models decided to model that seam line not on a natural panel line. In fact, it's right between 2 panel lines. And so I knew that I was going to have to take care of that, and that was going to be tricky because I had to be careful with where I was doing it because it was next to a bunch of windows to the cockpit window. The turtle deck area of the aircraft, that was a separate part that had a little bit of fit, self-inflicted fit issues. And so there was just a lot of stuff that I was dreading getting to this point where the fuselage was finally ready to go together. And it was a long road. Fortunately, I had a lot of good support for this project. I communicated often with my patrons, bounced a lot of ideas off of them back and forth, and they were so extremely encouraging and gave me good insight and good tips and ideas on things that I could do. And so they gave me a lot of strength and determination to work, to keep working on this. And then a small group of my closest friends in the modeling community were also extremely supportive and helpful. So fortunately for me, I had those people to kind of help motivate me and push me and encourage me to really move on this project. Now, the kind of one of the funny parts here is I originally wanted to have this done for the Rocky Mountain Hobby Expo, which was way back in June. And I kept telling my patrons, yeah, I'm this is what I want to do. I'm going to hurry up and get this done. And they were all like, no, don't rush. You don't want to rush this. It's not going to end well if you rush it. And fortunately I listened to them and I took my time. And so the total time on the actual B-17 here was just a little under 7 months. And it's the longest I've ever worked on one single kit in my lifetime. And so it worked out how it was supposed to in the end. I mentioned earlier, I'm using the bomb bay as the location to secure the post that's going to hold up the aircraft. And I needed to create a mounting system in there. And so I designed and 3D printed this plug that inserts into the bomb bay and really kind of locks in there. I printed these little blocks here to create the spacers for it and really create this solid attachment point in there that is also easy to, I can remove the aircraft from the stand so that I can transport it and store it and move it around as I need to, but it's easy to, put it back on its post for the display, but it holds it and locks it into place. And so I had to go through many iterations to get the right shape and size for it for me to be able to get it in there in the first place, and then but for it to like have the strength and rigidity it needed to support the weight of this kit, because there is not an insignificant amount of plastic in this kit, and a 1/48 scale B-17 is very large, so it needed to be strong enough to support the whole weight of the aircraft. And it's not at the center of balance on the aircraft. This actually holds it a little tail heavy, but in the end, I actually kind of like it that the actual aircraft has a slightly nose high attitude, but it makes sense to me because they were only running on about 60% of their available power at this point in the story. And so they probably would have had a slight nose up attitude anyways, just trying to maintain altitude. So in the end, I'm really happy with how it worked out, and it's a good system, and I'm quite pleased with it. So at this point now we can lock down the turtle deck. And like I said, there was a few slight issues here. I had to kind of force it down during the gluing process to make sure those gaps closed up. It still required a fair bit of sanding and filling. I'm not going to show the whole sanding and filling process on this. I've done that in countless other videos, and I already know the runtime for this video is going to be quite long, and just didn't make sense to add a lot of really repetitive nature. But just know that I spent probably a good solid week just filling and sanding seam lines all across the fuselage, not just the nose, but the bottom, everything. It took a while, but I got it done to a point that I was really happy with it. And now we can kind of start adding all the final clear parts and things like that to the exterior and prepare ourselves for the actual exterior painting. Overall, the clear parts fit pretty well. The larger windows in the nose here, I had slight issues getting them to fit, so I don't know if that was because the interior parts that they're supposed to interface with, I didn't get them properly aligned, which is the most likely culprit here, but nevertheless, gave me a little bit of a fit issue. Nothing terrible, though. The rest of it all fit really nicely and went in just fine. I was actually really pleased with how well the cockpit windows went in. I was a little afraid those weren't going to fit well, but they did, and get those all locked down. And then the next big challenge for this was actually like filling in all of the large cavities that I was going to have on the aircraft. And in the end, I decided on using cotton balls because I knew that they would be able to fill in the space, but not exert enough pressure to break details on the interior and knock stuff off, which would have been kind of a disaster if, like a critical figure or component on the interior got knocked loose after everything had been closed up, and I wouldn't be able to reach in there and get the part fixed or reapplied. That would have been kind of devastating. So in the end, it was kind of a pain to deal with cotton balls because the fibrous nature of them, but I think it was worth it in the end to be able to fill in a lot of these voids with very little effort, and I think it worked out pretty good. So now we can kind of move on to the main event. Here is the painting, and like I've done before, everything gets primed black. I'm using the Rust-Oleum 2X black primer, and we're going to go ahead and start giving everything a coat of aluminum here. One of the very nice things about the HK kit that I didn't know going into this was it actually gives you separate parts for raised and lowered landing gear. So you don't have to make any modifications to the landing gear parts to have them in the raised position. That's actually pretty cool. That's very uncommon in model manufacturers. So there's a lot of parts getting painted aluminum just because they're aluminum, but I also needed to add a lot of aluminum to the actual airframe. And that's because in the process of being damaged, bullets, shells, flak damage, things like that, it'll hit the metal surface of the aircraft, and it can cause the paint to flake away from around those points of damage. And it was important to me to really try and portray that well and accurately. So what you're seeing me do here is kind of pre-paint this aluminum around all of the areas that could potentially have damage. And, areas where maybe not even necessarily like penetrating damage, but small bits of flak could still hit the surface of the skin, not penetrate and make a hole, but still be strong enough to flake paint. And so it was important that I try and get as I suppose I could have just completely painted the whole thing and that would have been fine. I chose not to, just purely just a conscious choice. And that probably would have given me a little bit more freedom to be a little bit more extreme with the distressing. But in the end, I'm still quite pleased. So the first step for this is going to be applying liquid mask. And I'm using just kind of a sharpened wooden dowel here. And I'm applying it around the very edges of the damage impact points. And this is going to be like representing that immediate paint flaking from around that point of impact. Chipping would have been fairly... I don't know if I have the right words to describe what it would look like, but it's a pretty solid, like the paint flakes off in large solid chips for the most part. And so that's what this is going to represent. This is a bit of a tedious process, and you have to really kind of go slow, take your time, and make sure you're getting all of the damaged areas. And on some of them, I'm adding more of the liquid masks. On others, I'm doing less, just to represent, different amounts of paint being chipped away. And but just trying to maintain those solid, essentially blocks of exposed aluminum around the aircraft. And this was another one of those details, just like the bullets, the 50 caliber casings on the floor, that from the onset of this project, I knew that I wanted to replicate, and it was going to be an important part of getting this right. So once those had dried, now I'm going in the same liquid mask and a sponge, and this is going to create a little bit more of a random, smaller flaked paint, chipped paint around some of the more heavily damaged areas. And this will allow a little bit more, I'm not quite sure what the right word would be, but just a little bit more randomness to the damage patterns, as opposed to the very strategic locations that I did with the toothpick. And it allowed me to go heavier in certain areas, like around the right waist area, which received extensive damage, around the area in the radio room, which received extensive damage, versus just like a regular machine gun bullet hit, which would have just punched a hole and flaked a little bit of paint off around the edges. So at this point now, all the liquid mask is done, and I'm going to go back and cover everything in a nice thin coat of black paint, just to kind of bring everything even again, so that I can go through the next steps of the painting process. And that's going to start with a pre-shading process here. Now, on an aircraft this large, this was a very painful process. This really gave me some good hand cramps, and because it requires a lot of control, a lot of precision, a lot of keeping your hand essentially locked in one position to do this. But something that I knew that I wanted to do, and I knew that it would work for the vision that I was going for. So again, this was something that this is one of those things where it's like, I don't want to extend this out over multiple evenings. This was just like, I'm going to sit down for 2.5 hours and just knock this out. Cause it's not just the fuselage. You have to do the wings and the horizontal stabilizers, and a lot of work. But with that done, we can go ahead and start laying down our actual colors here. So for the underside, using this dark gold gray, so normally these would have been painted a neutral gray on the underneath, but I find that a lot of the paint manufacturers tend to have their neutral gray be really more dark than looks right to me. So I like this dark gold gray as a slightly lighter variant, option to your typical neutral gray color. And I think this just looks a little bit better. And I've used this paint combination on the P40 that I did not too long ago. And, and essentially the P40 was a good test drive for this paint combination. I'm really pleased with it. I ended up using it on another build that I did during this time as well. another P51, which you'll see on the channel later. And it's pretty much going to be my go-to when it comes to olive drab over neutral gray paint schemes. Now for the olive drab portion, I'm using a very familiar paint for me. This is the Ammo MIG olive drab series of paints. They have about 6 different olive drab variations. This one is called olive drab base, and this is kind of just your standard olive drab color. And this is a good place to start and allow you to build up different variations to this paint, and what could otherwise be a really boring paint job. This giant aircraft all painted olive drab, it can be pretty boring. But with the different paint versions they have of this, you can have a lot of fun doing some variations, and so you'll see a little bit of that later on. But this is going on relatively thin. We still want some of that pre-shading to show up and to show through and give us some nice little tonal variation. So here's kind of the overall model, kind of put together just to kind of see how everything's matching up and blending together. Did I match the correct thickness and tone from the wings to the fuselage, that kind of thing. And now we're going to work with this one here. It's called Olive Drab Highlights. And this is a lightened version of the Olive Drab base. And I'm going to use this for all of the fabric control, covered control surfaces. The control surfaces that were fabric color, it would have accepted when it was painted, the paint would react differently to the fabric than it would to like the metal, for example, and it would fade and wear differently than the metal would. So I'm doing all of the control surfaces in this olive drab highlight color, and you can see it's significantly lighter with a little bit more yellow in it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to thin it down a little bit and start doing a little bit of like selective highlighting around the aircraft, mainly around areas where the ground crew would be working on the aircraft. And so the center portion of the wing here is where all of the fuel tanks were. So they would have had ground crew up there walking around, filling up the fuel tanks, things like that. Did a little bit of wear on the engine nacelles where ground crew would have been doing maintenance there. And then I did a little bit across the upper portion of the fuselage, just, additional sun fading, trying not to go super heavy with it, again, because this was a fairly new aircraft and hadn't seen extensive combat. Now, the next one you're using is Olive Drab Dark. This is a much darker, more green version of Olive Drab. And if you notice on a lot of old pictures of B-17Fs, you'll notice that a good portion of the vertical fin is a slightly different, usually darker version of Olive Drab from the rest of the aircraft. And that's because, as I understand it, this portion of the vertical fin was actually built and painted at a separate location and then shipped to the Boeing factory and assembled onto the rest of the aircraft. And so the paints didn't always match up. And I thought that was a neat little detail and would create a fun little variation to the overall paint scheme. Next up, we're doing all of the de-icing boots. Now, you'll notice in many versions of the B-17 that they actually ended up removing the de-icing boots on some of them, and they would be left with this like nice shiny aluminum underneath. From all the contemporary pictures that I could see of other B-17s from this bomb group, they still had their de-icing boots at least during December of 1943. So they are painted that way. You do actually have to make a modification to the kit because the kit wants you to portray them as having no de-icing boots on there. There's exposed rivets. You have to fill the rivets in because the de-icing boots were just basically rubber and you wouldn't see rivets. So just be aware. And now we're going to move on to painting markings. And again, I'm returning to kit mask, just like I did with the Franz Stigler 109. We're going to be painting as many of the markings as we possibly can on here. And that's because I knew that there were going to be markings that were going to be covering areas of the aircraft that were going to be damaged. And just from my previous experience, I knew it was just going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to really get the decals to snuggle down over jagged, torn pieces of plastic. And it was just, I knew it was not going to give me the look that I wanted. And I decided to turn to Kit Mask, who very graciously helped me out with this and set up this masking set for me so that I could, realize the vision that I wanted. And I hope you'll see a little bit later on, once I start removing the mask and I start removing all of the liquid mask over the damaged areas, just how effective the painted markings are going to look compared to what they could have done if they were decal. So we get all the emblems, the stencils on there. We're going to start painting. And another nice thing about painting markings, it allows you to build in some, weathering and wear to the markings as well, which is something that's hard to do with decals. So, kind of a nice bonus there. So we're going to start with a base of white. A lot of the markings are going to start with white, and I have to do the markings in multiple layers. Otherwise, the stencils would overlap each other, and it just wouldn't work out very well. So next up, we're using Signal Blue on the national insignia here. This takes a couple of coats to get it like to that nice, rich, dark blue for the national insignia. And you'll notice on, I think it's actually this side of the fuselage, that there's a couple areas where I don't quite get it as nice and even as I should have, but in the end, I got it close enough. So removing the masking here was so incredibly satisfying. Like, one of the most satisfying masking pulls I've done in a long time. And you can start to see around some of the damaged areas where you can see some of that exposed aluminum color where my stencils pulled that up. At this point, that's okay. I can deal with that. It's not a big problem, but it kind of gives you a little glimpse preview into what we're expecting here. And so we're going to hit some of the markings here with just straight black, as opposed to like what I would normally use, which would have been NATO black. I wanted it to have a contrast against the black of like the de-icing boots and things like that. Now we're going to do squadron codes. I'm not going to say definitively that they were 100% painted gray. I think there's argument could be made that they could have possibly been painted yellow. I'm not an expert, so I'm just going off of, kind of what the research other people have done, and I'm good with that. So do the aircraft number here, the bureau number on the tail. Again, this was kind of tricky because I had to do these numbers over damaged areas, and that kind of screwed up the alignment a little bit, but in the end I got there. So now we can do the really fun reveal part, and that's removing all the liquid mask. So I'm using this really dense rubber that I picked up at a arts and crafts store that's meant for removing liquid mask. So the rubber really grabs onto the liquid mask, which is also kind of like a rubber-like material, and just pulls it right off. And you can start to see that beautiful aluminum showing through, and just that nice, like, bright, shiny metal underneath the paint. And yeah, this was really exciting, starting this process and really seeing all this damage, starting to expose itself. And it was at this point in the process, like, I'd gotten the paint down, things were finally coming together for me, and this was a point in the project where I was probably the most excited about everything. Like, I was finally starting to realize, okay, this is this is turning out how I imagined it in my head. And from this point on, the build went really fast. I was like, I'm not going to work on anything else until I get this done, because now I was finally really having a fun experience with this. So this type of weathering, damage and exposing the metal, really kind of activates those neurons in my brain, because it's, this is true in sense that, like, I'm exposing paint, a color underneath other paint, just how it would have been on the real thing. And yeah, just very satisfying, very fun. And it was almost like like, ooh, what do I get to reveal next? What cool damage is it going to show when I reveal the next thing? So at this point, we're going to go ahead and seal in all of this work that we've done with a nice, good, solid gloss coat. In fact, I actually ended up doing 2 layers on here. I didn't want to take any chances and make sure that this was all nice and varnished and taken care of so that we could do all the rest of our work on top of it, seal all this in, and like again, this was the really fun part of the process. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to my father once again, and he's going to kind of take us through the entire mission that Ye Olde Pub had on that December 1943 day.
The encounter of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown. I want to take you back to the skies over Europe in the winter of 1943. It was a world at war, a world where mercy was scarce and survival was never guaranteed. In that setting, on December 20th, 1943, something extraordinary happened. Something so unlikely, so deeply human, that it has been remembered as one of the great stories of honor in modern warfare. It is the story of two young men, enemies by uniform, brought together in a moment of choice. Franz Stigler, a German fighter ace, and Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old American pilot flying his very first mission. That morning, Charlie Brown and his crew of 10 climbed into their B-17 Flying Fortress, a bomber they had nicknamed Ye Olde Pub. Their target was Bremen, a heavily defended industrial city in northern Germany. This was Charlie's first combat mission. He was nervous but determined. Like every crew, they were briefed, loaded with bombs, and launched into the gray skies of occupied Europe. But almost as soon as they reached their target, disaster struck. German flak, those black puffs of exploding anti-aircraft fire, tore into the formation. Charlie's plane was hit again and again. One engine was knocked out. The nose of the bomber was smashed open. A cannon shell ripped through the cockpit, nearly killing Charlie and his co-pilot. Blood ran down their faces from shrapnel. Still he pressed on. Ye Olde Pub dropped its bombs on Bremen. But the damage was catastrophic. Struggling behind the formation, the bomber became a sitting duck for German fighters. One after another, Messerschmitts tore through the crippled plane. The tail gunner was killed instantly. The rest of the crew were wounded, some gravely. Holes opened in the fuselage so wide that you could see daylight straight through the aircraft. The oxygen system failed. One engine was on fire. By all logic, the B-17 should have fallen from the sky, but somehow, through determination and sheer luck, Charlie kept her flying. Limping along at barely 200 miles an hour, dropping altitude fast, he turned west, hoping against hope to reach England. Meanwhile, on the ground, a German pilot was climbing into his fighter. His name was Franz Stigler. Franz was an experienced ace, credited for dozens of kills. He had flown in North Africa and had seen more than his share of combat. By 1943, he was back in Germany, tasked with intercepting Allied bombers. That afternoon, he took off in his Messerschmitt 109. As he scanned the sky, he spotted something unusual, a lone B-17 limping along, far behind the formation. For a fighter pilot, this was an easy prey. A straggler like that was practically a gift. One short burst from the cannon, and it would be all over. Franz pushed the throttle and closed in. As he approached, Franz prepared to fire, but then he looked more closely. The bomber was destroyed, its nose blown open, its tail barely hanging on, its engines failing, and through the holes in the fuselage, Hans could see the men inside. They were not manning their guns. They were slumped over, bleeding, tending to one another. He saw blood on the floor, faces pale, hands trembling. These men weren't fighting, they were dying. Franz later said to shoot them down would have been murder. In that moment of his training, his orders and his conscience collided. He knew that if he fired, no one would ever question it. In fact, if he downed the bomber, it would complete a tally he needed to earn the King's Cross, one of Germany's highest honors. But Franz could not do it. His Catholic upbringing, his family's refusal to join the Nazi Party, and the lessons he had learned in North Africa, you fight by the rules of honor, you don't kill defenseless men, all came rushing back. He took his finger off the trigger. Instead of destroying the bomber, Franz pulled up alongside of it. He flew wingtip to wingtip with Charlie Brown. Imagine Charlie's terror. Sitting in a shattered cockpit, blood running down his face, engines failing, when suddenly a German fighter appears right beside him. He was certain that this was the end. But instead of firing, Franz gestured. He pointed down, signaling Charlie to land in Germany. Surrender, he was saying. You'll survive. But Charlie refused. He kept flying west, towards the North Sea. Franz realized that what Charlie intended, he was trying to make it home, across the sea, back to England. So Franz made another remarkable decision. He stayed with the bomber. Flying so close the American crew could see the rivets on his fighter, Franz escorted Ye Olde Pub towards the coast. His presence confused the German flank batteries below. Seeing a Messerschmitt flying beside a bomber, many of them held their fire, thinking it was a German plane turning to base. Together, German fighter and American bomber flew in silence. No shots were fired, just two enemies, side by side, in a brief truce of mercy. When they reached the edge of the North Sea, Franz knew he could go no further. If he continued, he risked being shot down by the Allies. So he pulled up alongside the cockpit one last time. Charlie turned his head and saw the German pilot clearly for the first time. And Franz did something simple but unforgettable. He looked across the gap, raised his hand, and gave a salute. Then he peeled away, banked his Messerschmitt, and turned back towards Germany. Charlie Brown and his battered crew flew on, across the cold waters of the North Sea. Somehow making it back to England. Against all odds, they survived. Charlie reported what had happened, but at first few believed him. Who would believe that a German ace had spared a crippled bomber, had even escorted it to safety? Franz, for his part, told no one. To have spared the enemy was dangerous. Had his superiors known, he could have faced court-martial, even execution. So he kept it secret. For decades, the story lived only in the memories of the men who had been there. Nearly 50 years later, Charlie Brown, now retired, living in the United States, set out to find the German pilot who spared him. Through research, veteran networks, and a bit of luck, he finally tracked down Franz Stigler, who by then was living in Canada. When they met, Charlie embraced Franz and said, "You saved my life." And Franz replied, "I didn't spare you. I spared my conscience." The two men became friends, almost like brothers. They would often appear together at reunions and events, telling their story, not as enemies, but as men bound forever by a moment of shared humanity. Their friendship lasted the rest of their lives. What do we make of this encounter? War is cruel. It strips away compassion. It teaches men to hate, to dehumanize, to kill without hesitation. And yet, in the middle of the bloodiest conflict the war had ever known, one man chose differently. Franz Stigler could have taken the shot. He could have earned glory, medals, recognition. Instead, he chose mercy. He chose not to see uniforms, but men. He chose humanity over hate. And Charlie Brown, bleeding, terrified, yet determined, chose to lead his crew to keep flying, and to never give up. Together, they remind us that even in the darkest time, the light of honor and compassion can shine through. On December 20th, 1943, high over Germany, a German fighter pilot and an American bomber crew met as enemies. They parted as something far greater. Not long after Franz Stigler reflected on that day, he said, "I couldn't have shot them. I would have shot myself instead." That is the legacy of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown, a reminder that even in war, our choices matter, that mercy is possible, and humanity can endure, and that sometimes the greatest victory is not destruction, but the decision to spare life.
After reading A Higher Call, it was kind of that concept, that idea, that really pushed me to want to do this project. And while I don't necessarily have a deep personal connection to this project, I don't, I'm not like related to any of these people, I knew that this was a poignant moment that I wanted to try and capture. And it kind of evolved into something that was personal to me, just through the and I apologize, this is hard to put into words for me. I think about it often, but I don't often verbalize it. But being able to kind of see like the good in humanity, and I think now more than ever, when times feel tough and seems like darkness is around us, that we need these moments to be able to reflect on the good that people can do. And so, yeah, I think I echo what my father has said, and that, this is a poignant story and a reminder for us. So moving on with the build, I'm painting the engines right now, and these are 3D printed engines from a matter of scale. And the detail on these engines is just absolutely exceptional. A matter of scale also did all of the machine guns for the build as well, and so I'm hugely grateful to Matter of Scale for sending this out to me and allowing me to put this on the project, because this is a huge improvement over the kit parts, and you can just see all the lovely detail, the ignition wires, that everything is represented here, and unfortunately my painting does not do these 3D prints justice, but I'm trying the best I can here. And I mean, you could spend a long time painting up these engines. And fortunately, one of the nice things about radial engines, if you've watched this channel long enough and you've seen enough of my build videos, you'll know that I'm a really big fan of radial engines. Just for one, like, they're cool looking, they sound fantastic, but as in the world of scale modeling, they're great because it's a little bit of that exposed mechanics and engineering on a model that you get to represent. And many kits will kind of, I don't really want to say dumb down the detail, but really, simplify the detail of a radial engine. And a radial engine is an extremely complex piece of machinery. There's a lot going on. And I've done a lot over the years to try and create my own details, but having these 3D prints out of the box as a drop-in replacement is just like, it's so nice, it's so easy, and it's a huge improvement over the kit parts. For the exhaust on this aircraft, I wanted to try something slightly different, and with how I painted and prepared them. So I experimented, played around, and I came up with this pretty straightforward and simple method. So I painted the exhaust aluminum, And then I'm applying Parasite Brown and this kind of leather brown as two wet coats. Like I'm blending these colors together. They're going wet over wet. They're kind of thin. I want some of that metallic showing through. And then once they dry, and sorry, I should apologize. I didn't put any kind of like clear varnish over the metallic paint, so it's just metallic paint and then the acrylic paint, and now I'm doing this enamel wash. And what I found that the acrylic paint actually didn't fully adhere to the nice smooth metallic paint. So as I'm removing the excess wash here, it also exposed some of that bare aluminum paint underneath, and I'm very, very happy with the results here. So this is the exhaust system, and the exhaust would come off of the engine, go into the turbochargers. The turbochargers would help increase air volume into the engine, therefore allowing them to create more horsepower up high altitude. And this system would get very hot, and it would distort the metal and discolor the metal. So that's the effect that I was going for. And I was, again, very pleased, very happy with how that turned out. And another thing I wanted to talk about really quickly was just the weathering and staining I added to the top of the wings. I really tried hard not to like ever criticize other modelers, but some modelers get it wrong. There's these vents that sit behind the engines on the top of the wings. Those are vents for like the oil coolers and the intercoolers for the radiator, for the engines. They're not actual exhaust vents. And so many modelers will depict like brown soot coming out of those vents, and that is technically not correct. What you will see is oil streaming off of the engine and actually going in between those vents, because there would be a lot of hot air coming out of those vents from the radiators, from the intercoolers, that would actually blow off any kind of debris or soot from the engines. And so just to point it out. Now, that's not like a hard and fast rule. There's always exceptions. I'm sure someone's going to be able to point to a photographic evidence saying, no, that's not correct. But in generally, that is how it worked. At this point, all the weathering's done, and this is really just kind of like the final assembly moment, adding all these tiny little details to the project to really help bring it alive. And one of the things I wanted to do here was, so the right waist gun was essentially blown out of the aircraft. It was completely sheared off of its mount, and I kind of wanted to have the ammo chute like trailing out the aircraft, as if it, like the gun had been ripped from its mount and pulled the ammo chute out and it was slapping against the side of the fuselage. I just thought that would be kind of a neat moment to help show a little bit of dynamic, motion to the model. There's these little air deflectors that kind of pop out when the windows are open for the gunner positions. I'd originally had them on the build earlier on during the painting process, but I managed to knock them off. So that was just me putting them back on, getting the radio room gun installed. The radio room gun was a neat little like model unto itself, and there was many different mounts for this gun on the different versions of the B-17. So you'll have to do your research on if you're building it, how it was mounted. But again, contemporary, it looked like that was how it was mounted. Tail guns going on. I do a little bit of work here off camera to kind of emphasize the violence in the tail section here. You'll see it in the final, the final reveal of the model. I chose not to depict that as a work in progress part, but just be aware that there was some additional gore that had to be added there. Antenna going on, left waist gun going in. Again, this is the matter of scale guns with the master brass barrels. Fantastic combination. Top turret going in. The top turret was technically the only gun system that was working on Yield Pub, but in fear of essentially being shot down, they didn't actually use the turret. But for a portion of the flight in formation with Franz Stigler, the top turret gunner was in the turret, just didn't have the turret pointed at the 109, but I do have the figure in there looking at the 109, kind of keep an eye on him. One nice thing about the HK kit is the fact that the wings have this slot, and it's a very secure like slotting method to install them, which is nice because it allows me to remove the wings so I can transport this if I need to take it to a show or whatever, and it makes it very convenient to move it around. Adding all the details to the nose section, we get the cheek guns going in, the Norden bomb sight going in, and then we can install the nose, the very nose gun. So we insert the barrel first, and then we're going to insert the barrel into the actual gun breech. And I've already attached the ammo chute and the ammo can to the gun, and so we can just kind of slot that all in there as a whole unit. Again, the photo etch ammo belts really help add a lot to the busy and claustrophobic nature of these B-17s, and trying to imagine there's another guy that would have been in there, all these guns, ammo everywhere. It just would have been chaotic at best to be in this thing. Pitot tubes going on. I couldn't really tell if they would have been painted the upper surface color or the lower surface color. I ended up choosing the upper surface color. Don't know if that's 100% accurate or correct, but looked good to me. Next up is the radio antennas. Now, I kind of inadvertently caused myself a little bit of an issue here with how I modeled the damage in the radio room, because the panel that's peeled back actually had one of the attachment points for one of the radio antennas. And so I had to try and figure out, okay, how am I going to do this? And I just kind of realized, well, it would be interesting to have the radio antenna on the right side, pulled taut, but then have the radio antenna on the left side slack, because that portion of the fuselage has been peeled away. And then, in my mind, it was like the radio antenna didn't get severed, but it's no longer under tension because that panel is pulled back, and it would be kind of interesting to have that as something loose. But then I realized I also needed to have the inside portion of that, and so I decided to have that portion severed and kind of blowing it back against, along the flow of the airflow. Interesting little detail, but yeah. All right, so I've been getting a lot of questions in my previous videos about, Brett, how did you do the propellers? And this was something that I had to think about how I wanted to portray this. If you've watched my C-47 dual build, I built one of those in flight, and I used some photo etch prop blur effect for that. And it looked okay, but I wasn't like 100% satisfied with it because it was just one-dimensional, just a flat, thin disc. I wanted something that was three-dimensional, that really gave you the impression that these were propellers moving through the air. And I reached out to my friend Andy. He goes by the handle Mr. Plamo on Instagram and YouTube. And he's been practicing his 3D modeling skills. And so I put out a challenge to him. I was like, hey, do you think you could come up with an idea to do a 3D printed prop blur effect? And he was like, yeah, let's do this. And originally I was just going to have it printed in like gray resin, and then he suggested, well, what if we do it clear? And it was like it broke my brain. Like, that's such a genius idea, because as you can see here, I can paint the actual propeller part of it and kind of fade out the color, but have the rest of it clear. And I was so thrilled at what he came up with here, and these are actually prototypes, and he plans on selling these on his website, and I'll leave a link down below. He's refined the design a little bit, cleaned it up a little bit more. So I'm kind of proud to say that I've got kind of a one-of-a-kind thing here. And but nevertheless, so thrilled that my vision and his 3D modeling skills combined to bring this to pass. And because this is exactly what I was looking for in terms of portraying motion without it being, just a simple flat plane. And he was also kind enough to do the 109 propeller as well. So now I have spinning propellers for the pub. Like I mentioned before, the number 2 engine was shut down, so it doesn't get a propeller effect. I used the kit propeller, cut the blades off, repositioned them to show that as being feathered. And then there we go. So the final thing to do is bring it all together. I had contemplated many different ideas. I looked at other people's builds of this project and what they did. And some people did like a map. Some people did, the French countryside and clouds. And some people did other things. And I realized that I wanted something that was just really simple, really clean, so that the viewer could be focusing on the story being told here with the aircraft. And so to that end, I got a essentially 24-inch by 18-inch sheet of 1/4-inch black acrylic. And that was just going to be, and that was going to be it. That was going to be my display. It was going to be really simple. I didn't want anything to distract from the story that I wanted to tell. And I've not really worked with acrylic all that much. And so I was a little hesitant. I mean, this wasn't necessarily a cheap piece of acrylic. It was rather large. And so I was a little hesitant to like start drilling into it, but I knew that there really wasn't any other way. So I got a brand new drill bit. I wanted to make sure it was as sharp as possible so that I could make a clean cut into this acrylic. And fortunately, it worked out. It chipped a little bit on the underside, but I drilled from the top down, so there was no chipping on the top side of it. And then using some spray adhesive and some craft foam, I added these little pads on the bottom so that wherever I transport it and move it, it's not going to be sitting directly onto the acrylic, which could scratch it or cause problems. It would have this nice soft pad to sit on. And then finally, it was time to insert the rods that would carry both aircraft. These were super glued into place. And I had to play around with how high I wanted them. Again, there was a very specific image that I was trying to portray. Once those were in, it was just a matter of removing all the paper. And again, a very satisfying process here. And I knew as soon as I would take this paper off that it would instantly get dirty and dusty, and it'd be a constant battle to keep it from looking dirty. But I also got a little plaque made on Amazon, and with just a little bit of self-adhesive tape, this goes right on. And with that, we can start putting our aircraft on, and that will complete the display. So 8 months worth of work, all culminating here. Now, before we move on to the final reveal, I do need to acknowledge a few people here that helped with this project, who were instrumental with this project. So I hope you'll bear with me just for a few moments. First and foremost, I want to thank my patrons for supporting this channel, but also being a sounding board for me as I went through this process and listening to all of my frustrations, my roadblocks, and helping me work through those. I want to acknowledge Kevin and Janelle from kitmask.com. They're always willing to help me out with a project, and they are fantastic individuals, people, human beings, and I cannot speak highly enough about them. I want to thank Matters of Scale for their involvement with the project and for helping me to maximize the detail I can get out of this project with both the engines and all of the armament for the aircraft. I want to thank Andy from Mr. Plamo for helping me get these 3D printed propellers done, so that that was kind of the final piece of the puzzle to really bring this all together and to finalize my vision. And then finally, I want to thank Getz Minis for providing some of their black magic metal, which really helped to accurately portray the damage that I wanted to show. Well, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for supporting this project. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you know that this project meant a lot to me personally. And this was 8 months of blood, sweat, and tears, literally, to bring this together. And I'm just grateful to be able to share it with you. Hopefully some of you who didn't know about this story before will now know, and will go read the book, go learn the story. And like I said at the beginning of the video, if you make it this far, I've got a neat little teaser here, or a neat little bit of bonus footage here at the end. So thank you for watching. Catch you on the next video, and enjoy the bonus footage.